Einen wunderschönen guten Abend und herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer. Mein Name ist Julia André, ich leite den Bereich Bildung bei der Körber-Stiftung und begrüße Sie alle ganz herzlich zu unserer abendlichen Reise in die Zukunft und zurück. So ist unsere heutige Livestream-Veranstaltung betitelt und ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie alle heute Abend dabei sind. Prognosen sind bekanntlich schwierig, vor allem wenn sie die Zukunft betreffen. Dieses Bon mot, das ich sehr schätze, von dem man übrigens nicht genau weiß, wem es zuzuschreiben ist, kommt leichtfüßig und unterhaltsam daher. Es beschreibt aber auf den Punkt die harte Realität, die wir alle gerade am eigenen Leib erfahren, in der wir mittendrin stecken, seitdem ein kleines, unsichtbares Virus in unser aller Alltag eingebrochen ist und das weltweit. Wir erleben tagtäglich, wie schwierig, ja fast unmöglich es ist, Entscheidungen zu treffen, gute Entscheidungen zu treffen für die Zukunft, für uns alle, für unser Wohl, für die Gesundheit. Und das nicht eine Zukunft betreffen, die 10 oder 20 oder gar 100 Jahre vor uns liegt, sondern es geht um die nächsten Wochen, die kaum zu überblicken sind. Wir haben ein sogenanntes dynamisches Infektionsgeschehen. Es gibt immer wieder unerwartete Entwicklungen. Aktuell fürchten wir uns vor den Virusmutationen und niemand kann das Gesamtbild eigentlich wirklich einschätzen. Und es gibt viel wissenschaftliche Expertise, aber auch das haben wir in der Krise gelernt. Auch Wissenschaft bringt immer nur vorläufige Erkenntnisse hervor und muss immer wieder neue Fakten einbeziehen und zu neuen Erkenntnissen kommen. Das, was wir in der Pandemie erleben, ist aber nicht einzigartig für dieses Thema. Es lässt sich auch auf große andere gesellschaftliche Themen und Herausforderungen übertragen. Die Komplexität, die Unübersichtlichkeit, die Schwierigkeit, Entscheidungen heute zu treffen mit schwerwiegenden Folgen für die Zukunft, Interessen abzuwägen und in Einklang zu bringen. Das lässt sich auch übertragen auf große Themen wie den globalen Klimawandel, wie die Digitalisierung, die uns alle beschäftigt. Das sind also große Fragen. Wie gehen wir mit der Zukunft um? Wie wollen wir in Zukunft leben? Und wie entscheiden wir heute, damit das der Fall ist? Ich freue mich deshalb sehr, dass wir heute Abend einen Gast haben, der ausgewiesene Expertise zum Umgang mit Zukunft mitbringt. Loes Damhof arbeitet, forscht und lehrt an der Hanse-Universität für angewandte Wissenschaft in Groningen in den Niederlanden, von wo sie uns heute auch zugeschaltet ist. Und sie beschäftigt sich seit vielen Jahren mit etwas, das sich Futures Literacy nennt. Ich freue mich sehr, dass sie heute Abend hier ist. A very warm welcome to you, Loes. It's very nice to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, great to have you here. Was hinter diesem Konzept Futures Literacy steckt, darüber wird sie uns gleich ein bisschen was erzählen, die Grundlagen uns einführen und dann vor allen Dingen im Gespräch mit Anna-Lena Scholz darauf eingehen, was damit möglich ist und was sich dahinter verbirgt. Anna-Lena Scholz wird durch den Abend führen. Sie ist promovierte Literaturwissenschaftlerin und Redakteurin der Wochenzeitung Die ZEIT. Sie schreibt dort vor allen Dingen zu hochschulpolitischen Themen, zu Wissenschaftspolitik und zu Geisteswissenschaften. Ich freue mich sehr, Anna-Lena Scholz, dass Sie dabei sind und uns heute durch den Abend führen. Herzlich willkommen auch an Sie.
Thank you so much.
Ja, wie sich schon andeutet, noch einen kurzen Moment, ein paar Hinweise, bevor ich an Anna-Lena Scholz übergebe. Sie haben es schon mitbekommen, das Gespräch wird in englischer Sprache stattfinden, aber mit einer deutschen Simultanübersetzung. Wenn Sie es lieber im O-Ton, in der Originalversion verfolgen wollen, können Sie das auch tun. Dann müssen Sie jetzt ganz schnell auf die Facebook-Seite der Körber-Stiftung wechseln, wo die englische Version gestreamt wird. Und Sie sind ganz herzlich eingeladen, das schon vorweg, sich zu beteiligen mit Ihren Fragen, mit Ihren Anmerkungen. Und das Ganze können Sie tun über das Beteiligungstool Mentimeter. Das finden Sie unter menti.com Und der PIN, mit dem Sie sich einloggen können, das lese ich jetzt lieber ab, damit ich nichts durcheinander bringe, ist die 6643005. Das wird aber auch immer wieder unten eingeblendet, sodass Sie sich dann noch einloggen können. Ja, alles Weitere wird jetzt Anna-Lena Scholz übernehmen, die Ihnen Loes Damhof auch noch mal ausführlicher vorstellt. Ich freue mich sehr auf das Gespräch, auf Futures Literacy und wünsche uns allen einen unterhaltsamen und natürlich vor allen Dingen erkenntnisreichen Abend. Und jetzt übergebe ich an Anna-Lena Scholz.
Thank you so much. What will the future look like? We all know this is a difficult question. Maybe it is even the wrong question. Can we instead try to think about the future in a different way? What will our futures look like? How do we create our futures? I'm excited to again welcome tonight's speaker at this event of the Körber Foundation. She's an expert in the above-raised thought experiment. She's a lecturer of intercultural competences and global citizenship at Hanse University in Groningen, Netherlands. And because of her passion and skills in teaching, got awarded the title Dutch Lecturer of the Year in 2016. Most of all, though, she's an expert in the concept of teaching futures literacy in higher education. Since 2017, she's a consultant for UNESCO, teaching individuals as well as organizations to innovate our present and shape our future. A very warm welcome to you, Loes Damhof, and please imagine an audience applauding for you.
I can hear them.
Loes, when we prepared this event, we talked quickly on the phone and you said to me, oh, you know what, you can ask me anything, any question you want. Ladies and gentlemen, dear audience on your screens, that's an invitation we should accept. So please use the chat, send us questions, and I'm happy to add these into our discussion. I have a second screen here where I can see your questions. First, though, let us start with a little introduction into the topic. Loes, please tell us more about futures literacy. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and welcome to the audience listening, what I can only imagine from home. Really happy to be here and to share with you, well, a little bit of my journey into this new, pretty cutting edge capability. And a little bit of also of the methodology that stems from that. So yes, I'm from the Netherlands, and I understood almost all of the German introduction by Julia. But what I will do tonight is for you just to give you a little bit of a broad idea of concept, just to idea of what future literacy is and how and why we should use futures and how and why we should look more closely in how we anticipate. And after that, we will start a conversation, and then there's plenty of time for you to ask me anything, well, I mean, related to the topic, let's put it this way. So let's just, and I really want to stretch, because for me, this is also an ongoing learning journey. One of the things that future literacy is, it is really built on the collective intelligence from us. So it is about stretching our imagination regarding the future. So all your images of the future, your question, enrich my perception as well. So please feel free to do so. But first, I'm going to give you an introduction, a short introduction into future literacy, and then we'll get more deeper into the details. So if you look at the slide, I think my slides presentation is, you can see it on the screen. It says future literacy, the time to learn from the future is now. Now, you could argue there's always a good time to learn from the future, but why it feels more urgent now. And I think that has everything to do with the situation that we're in with the pandemic. It's not like that times are more uncertain, although people say that a lot, right? It feels times are more uncertain. It's, well, the future is uncertain. Times have always been uncertain. The future has always been uncertain, but somehow we perceive it as more uncertain. Why? Because our assumptions on continuity and discontinuity, what work is supposed to be, how we should learn, all those assumptions that we thought about, you know, how life would continue or work and learning, those assumptions are being challenged. So therefore, it feels more uncertain. And that's really the key of basically the key element of future literacy. It's what are our assumptions about the future. So I'm going to take you through this. And you'll see here, by the way, that I have also UNESCO chair on future literacy with my team at Hansen. So we do research on this as well. We'll get more to that later. So I just want to start with a quote from my dear friend, Bayo Akomolafe, Nigerian activist, philosopher, psychologist, writer. And this is a rephrase, going to paraphrase Nigerian proverb. These are urgent times, let us slow down. It feels like a contradiction, right? Urgent times, why would we slow down? It's true. This feels like times are urgent. There are a lot of challenges ahead. Climate change, the pandemic, of course. So there's obviously a very logical need to step it up, to get into action mode, to really do something and just solve these complex problems. And we often think that we can solve complex problems. But when we do that, if we're so eager to act, to react to those urgent times, we also tend to overlook a couple of things that are very, very important. So I want to invite you with me for tonight to slow down, just for this coming hour, to really rethink our behavior and thinking in the present. So what is futures literacy? It's a capability. It's a skill, a competency. And tomorrow at the Digital Summit on Education, I will talk more about why this is so important for education and educators. So this capability is about imagining imagining multiple and diverse futures. So really stretching the imagination. And it's also the practice of looking through those futures as lenses to look at the world anew, to look in the present with a different pair of eyes. So if you have glasses, imagine that, we look through them, through the future at the present. So how does that really work? To think about that, we think about the future almost all of the time. Every time we plan our day or we go to bed in the evening, we already think about the future. And it has a profound impact on how we think and behave in the present. So futures literacy, it is about future, but we're only using her. We're not, that's the only purpose of future literacy, using futures to really have a good look at how we think and behave in the present, even change our behavior. So just to get a little bit more into that. When we look around us, we often, we see futures everywhere. We see it on billboards, and especially now during COVID. All of a sudden, it becomes really interesting and almost more urgent to think about the future. And we see design your future, create our futures, building the future, future makers, transform the future. There are a couple of misconceptions behind these phrases. First of all, that there is one future. There is not. There are multiple futures. My future is very different than your future. My idea of the future is very different, probably very different from your idea of the future, right? When I think about the future, it might be 5 years from now, or 10 or 100. When you think about the future, it just might be about tomorrow. So there are multiple futures around us, not just one. And yet we talk about it like there is only one. So that's misconception number one. The other one is that somehow we can design the future. We can build it, create it, shape it. We cannot, for the simple reason that the future only exists in our imagination. And my imagination is different than yours. So when I'm thinking I'm shaping the future, what I'm actually doing, I'm shaping my image of the future that has an impact on the present. So you could even say that you're using the future to shape the present. And this is a very basic fact. The future is unknown, and you might think, well, yeah, duh. But actually, really think about it. That for something that we talk about so often, like it is there, create your future, shape your future. Are we ready for the future? I work in education, and everything that we do in education, whether we design lesson plans or we prepare students for a job market, everything evolves around preparing and planning our students for the later than now. The future is the later than now. It's the next second, next hour, next week, next 10 years. But it is unknown. It does not exist. We cannot know it. Every time we do a prediction, we do this based on assumptions, data, the knowledge that we have in the present. The moment we think the future is here, we can make it, it's already the present. And because it is unknown, well, it's easy because no one has ever been there. There's no data. No one has gone to the future and has come back and told us what it was like. It only exists in imagination. And you might think, well, yeah, but I have still a pretty good idea that tomorrow the sun will come up. Yeah, this is true. I think it's a scientific fact, and every morning the sun comes up. At the same time, if you think the sun will come up tomorrow, it's still a prediction. It's in our imagination. So just take a minute or maybe a second to think about that it does not exist. So we often find ourselves maybe even on a slippery slope or like a very thin line. When we're walking behind somebody that says, I know what the future will look like. It's over there. Follow me. It's a balancing act. And we have this false sense of security that, okay, so this is the scenario. There's the dot on the horizon. That's where we're going. But just think about it. It does not exist. So, and the moment we start believing that there's only one dot on the horizon, we might be overlooking a lot of important phenomena and a lot of things that matter to us the most. So it's a false sense of security. That's another. Oh, sorry. Yes, there we go. So so how do we use futures? I just talked a little bit about planning and preparation, which are two very common ways to use the future. So the first one, planning. When we plan the future, we do this in order to optimize it, to get to the best result. And you see here a picture, because I like rock climbing, of Alex Honnold. He's a free solo rock climber. He climbs here El Capitan in California without any form of protection, no rope. And he was only able to do that because he practiced every move. And just so you know, this is 1,000-meter sheer granite. He practiced every little move beforehand with the rope in order to eliminate all uncertainty, in order to get to the top, knowing that there's always a little bit of shed of uncertainty. But he did it so often that he felt completely safe so he could reach the top, eliminating uncertainty. This is an pretty extreme form of planning. But think about how often we have the illusion that if we plan something very, very carefully, there's no room for the unexpected. And again, we know now that that's of course not always true. But this is one way to use the future. Another one is preparation. When we think about the future in order to prepare for something, for contingency, for plan B. So think about how we roll out our planning for COVID. We're preparing ourselves for vaccination distribution, preparing ourselves for a third wave in the Netherlands that is most likely to be here in April. So this is another way to use the future, to prepare for something that you think is going to be here. These two, planning and preparation, are very common ways to use the future. We do it all the time, especially where I work in education, right? Preparing for the future. But there's, of course, the third way, and that is the unexpected, the unknown, the spontaneity, emergence, something that we cannot foresee. That is a third way to use the future, and that is exploring futures, imagining multiple futures. Why? So we can become more comfortable with the unexpected. Exploring multiple futures in our imagination, weird ones, bizarre ones, different ones, probable ones, desirable ones, getting more trained in examining multiple futures helps us to detect novelty in the present. Because when we stretch the imagination, we become more open for emergence and spontaneity. And all of a sudden, the need to eliminate uncertainty becomes a little bit less. Now, these three ways to use the future, one is not better than the other one, but we have been focusing too much on planning and preparation, and the other part has been underdeveloped. Futures literacy is in essential navigating between those anticipatory systems, the systems that we use, the ways of thinking in order to anticipate and think about the future. So navigating and making sure that these ways of using the future are equally developed that's where you're getting really close to understanding what future literacy is about. Now, how do we do that? How do we understand, how do we become open for emergence and explore multiple futures without falling into the trap of, again, planning and preparing and thinking that we know? We do this by accepting the fact that all predictions and hopes are based on assumptions, and we make them all the time. There's no judgment in there. We make an assumption the sun will come up tomorrow, make an assumption that that tomorrow I'm going to go to work, or the assumption that the sun will shine this afternoon. We do this all the time. But every time we do that, they're based on assumptions. And this is one of the key elements of futures literacy. By examining multiple futures, we teach students and faculty and people to identify the underlying assumptions. And by doing that, by really understanding what are the blind spots in our scenarios, we can question them, examine them, but just simple being aware of that the fact it is an assumption can open us up to the unknown. And then uncertainty becomes less of something to be scared of, but actually can become maybe even a friend or an ally. And I'm going to show this briefly. With every future literacy intervention or workshop, we use the same learning curve. We're trying to identify existing assumptions by exploring multiple futures. Then we're trying to use reframe scenarios to find, to really become aware of these assumptions. And then the new questions come up. It's really the kind of the lens that we put on, and we look at the present and the new. Now, this may seem still a little bit abstract. We'll go a little more into detail, but going through this learning curve, it's a steep learning curve to understand where our assumptions come from, because sometimes they are very deeply rooted. And it's hard to do because, as Brielle Miller, who was quoted here as well, would say, we're suffering from the poverty of imagination. Right? It's really difficult for us to imagine multiple futures. And so a lot of that futures we get fed by narratives, sci-fi novels, Elon Musk, Hollywood. So when we think about the future, we have these set images that pop up in our minds. And so we give the power of imagination often to people that come up with these images. But future literacy is also about reclaiming the power of imagination by understanding our own assumptions. So basically, if you're futures literate, what it does ultimately is about creating an enhanced perception, embracing complexity of the universe, and discovering kind of a new sense of agency. That what can I do now? Now I've discovered my assumptions about the future. And ultimately, when becoming future literate is understanding that the future does not exist, and you can use her as a lens, and understanding that if I am attached to certain futures, to certain dots on the horizon, that tells me a lot about what I find important in the present. And ultimately, it's not about changing the future, but it's changing the now and changing our behavior in the present. And that will help us looking at complex phenomena, challenging issues of our times with a different pair of eyes. So I'm going to stop it here. And I can only imagine there must be tons of questions to clarify what it was. But so far, a very, very brief introduction. What is a new capability, I'm sure, for a lot of people. So.
Yes, thank you so much. There are actually already coming questions in from the audience. Thank you so
Excellent.
much. Yes, but let me quickly start with a personal question.
Yes.
When and why did you start to think about the future in the way you do now?
Okay, that's actually before I became, you're saying that I was a senior lecturer intercultural competence. I did that for quite some time. That's my background, because I developed a lot of 21st century skills. So from there, I moved on thinking about what are certain skills that all students need all the time, like regardless of their profession, what skills do students need, what competencies for jobs that don't exist yet. So I was already thinking about that, and I would think about ethics and digital skills and intercultural competencies, and just not, we call them maybe the soft skills. But there was always an element to that I wasn't quite satisfied with, because I would say, oh, I teach my students for a future that does not exist. But then I thought, no future exists, right? So what am I saying? And I prepare them for jobs that don't exist. How do I do that? Yeah, ethics and media literacy, and sure, but I think there's an element of uncertainty that I think that we're teaching students to eliminate uncertainty. And I thought, I don't think that's the right way. I think it's good to not know sometimes. I think it's good to be comfortable with uncertainty, even appreciate uncertainty and complexity. Not try to solve it, but embrace it. Look at the world. It's a universe is incredibly complex. What an incredible place to be. Why do we want to solve it? So, but I didn't know how. So I had this hunger, this yearning for understanding how I would do that, until I came across, was invited, or I attended a workshop held by Kasper Nozazewski, now a dear colleague and friend. And I saw this a keynote by Riel Miller of UNESCO, and I remember thinking, it was a very short presentation, but I thought I didn't really understand it, but I thought, this is it. Wow. So back then, I was just teaching, and I had this idea of this, I think, but how am I going to do this? I don't have any money or time, and then I was very fortunate enough to win the national award, and some money came with it. So I contacted Riel Miller UNESCO, and I said, I have this scholarship and I want to spend it on your thing. And he said, sure, come to Paris. So I flew to Paris in one day, back in the day, 5 years ago, a couple of weeks ago, exactly 5 years ago. I flew to Paris, and I remember this incredible moment. I talked to him for 5 hours. He tried to explain to me what future literacy was, and I still couldn't quite get what it was, because it was so heavy on language. But then I remember it felt like stepping over a threshold, and that you're entering this new amazing place. There's so much to discover, and this moment of transformative learning that you think, this is great. And I flew back, and I was completely hooked. And then I decided to educate myself, learn everything there was to learn. And I was already kind of halfway, right, thinking about these things. So for me, it just felt like coming home and being on exploration at the same time. And together with Riel Miller, I developed a lot of courses. I got a team together. And now we are one of the few places yet, there will be more, also in Germany, that trains people in this capability and teaches it, and specifically futures literacy. So not just foresight, but specifically futures literacy. So yeah, that was 5 years ago. And I still feel like I have a lot to learn. So I'm very lucky.
I think the term is still fairly unknown in Germany. And what I find most interesting is the metaphor you're using, to be literate about the future. So I wonder also the way you're describing it from your perspective or your learning experience. Would you say that it's really, do you compare becoming literate about the future to not being literate in the common sense of the world of the word?
Yeah, well,
through the world, and you cannot read, and suddenly you go to school, you can read, and your horizon expands.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. Both are our competencies, right? And the moment, think about if you're illiterate, right? So you go to a place and you see all these signs, but they don't make sense yet, right? You see, you can't read. I mean, you can't, so they don't have meaning. And the moment you start to learn how to read, and it opens up this incredible, it opens up a lot of opportunities, but it's also incredibly empowering. It gives you this sense of power that you can not only read, but also maybe create. Yeah. And so that is very empowering. And the moment you start learning how to read, it's impossible to not read. The moment you see a word on the street or a street sign, it's impossible not to read it, right? So, and so that's pretty similar in the sense that futures literacy is about seeing, it has the same sense of empowerment. All of a sudden you see opportunities arise, and the phenomenon that pop up, the novelty that you could sense, you can, there's a sensing that things are changing or things are happening, but you can't really make sense of it. And if you imagine multiple futures, so not just following one scenario, but imagine multiple futures, all of a sudden, all these things around you start to make more sense. You can give words to it, or you can, it's just, so in a way, there are similar, but I think the biggest reason to call it futures literacy, because it really refers to a competency and a skill, and not just a workshop or just one moment in time, but something that you need to practice. And so that is also important. Learning how to read and write takes practice, and this is a really different way of thinking and looking at the world, and that takes practice too. You just, and with every capability, who knows what people will do with it. For some people, they become Shakespeare, and other people, So some people feel extremely empowered and use it to do tremendous things, and sometimes other ways they don't. So that's with every capability. So it has that. Yeah.
So you're teaching workshops about this all over the world, and I was wondering how these workshops or labs differ from country to country, because if you teach futures literacy in China, it must be different than in Germany or the United States, because you have different assumptions about the future. So how do you prepare yourself, or what have you learned from the different cultural backgrounds about the future? Because there must be as many futures as countries as we have.
Oh, there's many futures as people all over the world.
Yes,
so you're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, we even though with my friends or family in the same bubble, we still have different ideas of the future. So so there are definitely differences, and everybody uses the future. So there's also a huge similarity in the sense that even babies and kids, and you can say that living organisms use the future, leaves on the tree and birds. So everybody uses the future, whether it's short-term oriented cultures or long-term oriented cultures, right? Everybody uses it. So that is a common, that's something that everybody has in common. We all anticipate. But it's a sure difference. I've done, in China. For what is interesting is that in certain cultures, the collective, there's a lot more need to discuss futures as a collective practice. So, well, let's say in the Netherlands, for example, in our classes, we put a lot of emphasis on the personal reflection of the assumptions. Where do they come from? How does it make you feel, etc. So really, it's a very reflective, individual part of our workshops. In other cultures that are more collectivistic, or built more on the community, we just design it differently. So we build more on the sharing understanding of the community. It's about the future of the country. It's about the future of the community, and it's sometimes less about the individual reflection on the assumptions. And in other cultures, in the Netherlands, we use a lot of language, written and verbal language. And in other cultures, if I work in Nigeria or Somalia, then we start with, start with music, or more theater, drama, or play, or creativity. And proverbs are different ways. So there's also a different language that you can use in different cultures. And UNESCO has been running these workshops also all over the world. So I work a lot with them. And and what we do is that we train people to design, facilitate these processes as well. So we teach the capability to students and faculty and professionals, and we also teach them how to facilitate. And then these intercultural competences are very important. And I have to say, there's still, because this is relatively new, there's a lot of opportunity to do a lot of research on the differences. So there's still a lot to explore, what works best, for sure.
Let me start with the first question we have here, because I think this ties in. Somebody's asking about Hollywood. The sources we have to imagine the future are usually mostly American movies. So how can we, I mean, this is something maybe many people all over the world share. We have watched the same movies that come from a very specific part of the world, from Hollywood. So is this a good thing because it connects people all over the world, or how do we also break free from the popular culture that shapes the future in a certain way that maybe isn't even as broad as you want it to be?
Yeah, right. Well, pop culture is interesting because pop culture sometimes has an impact on and think about Star Trek. I think they used a lot of gadgets in Star Trek that we started to use, after that. So it shapes technology. But I think that, a lot of the images that come up, if I ask people, what do you think 2060 or 2070 looks like? A lot of images come up out of movies, right? And they're often dystopian, a lot of technology. So Hollywood, the movies in Hollywood have a profound impact on how we see futures because they're so popular and there's also a danger to it because think about who has the power in these movies. Who plays the villain? What is the role of technology? The role of climate? So also think about that. If we would only leave it up to Hollywood, for example, or Elon Musk, are they not in fact colonizing the future, colonizing futures? So that's why it is so incredibly important to put a story, a narrative next to it. And think about a movie like Black Panther. Wakanda was, this fictional African country, was a credible, powerful image of that reshaped the vision that a lot of people had about Africa as a place where innovation was booming and that people that they had a choice to share or not to share. And I think it is important to put that narrative next to it. There's a Nigeria, I work with, I love Nigeria. There's a Nigerian proverb that says, unless the lion learns how to speak, the hunting story will always glorify the hunter. And that's maybe speaks to the Hollywood stories that, you can say that, okay, we should teach the lion how to speak. But what we're saying is that, no, we should look at a narrative altogether. And why do we pick the hunting story? Why are we not, why are we not showing another narrative, another story? So I think that Hollywood, that's why it's important that diversity, that other narratives are there as well. But Hollywood is not, sci-fi. Novels have the same impact. And tech companies who make predictions. Hollywood is a fictional story, but think about what tech companies, when they do a prediction, this is where it's going to go, how often people adopt without really asking the question, this might be a probable future, but is it also a desirable future? And that question we don't even ask ourselves. So think about who has the power in the narratives. And this is something you agree with. Yeah.
Before we come to the topic of futures literacy and policymaking, I want to add another question that is kind of more about the concept in general, because somebody's asking why the concept is not yet known in Germany, in the political sphere. Maybe you could give us some insight about how far futures literacy has,
become mainstream.
In, amongst politicians, NGOs, other countries. It must be different from country to country.
It is. I have to say there's very hopeful news from Germany. My friend Stefan Bergheim, who just published a book on future Zukunft. I hope he forgives me that I forgot the exact title. I hope he's watching it, put it in the Mentimeter. But Stefan Bergheim is doing a lot of work, and he's one of the people that I work with, that I trained actually, that we work with on future literacy and rolling it out in Germany. So it's starting. They're starting to roll and do these a lot of labs. In terms of governments and policies, UNESCO has been advising policymakers and governments a lot of it on the African continent and the Middle East and some of it in Asia. But it's always been these moments of time when they used future literacy laboratories, these workshops, as 3 or 4 days a workshop when they look at the future of migration, for example. But because it's a capability, it needs more investment and it needs more practice. And you need to make space. Just making space for a few days is not enough. You need to make space for people to adopt and implement this kind of thinking into their strategic decision making. And so that takes time. And yes, it differs per country, but if with any innovative practice, it starts from the bottom up, and you need change from the top down as well. And futures foresight and future studies and teaching futures has been around longer. Finland has has a lot of experience in that. They're pretty. Denmark has a very long-standing futures institute in Copenhagen. In America, there's an organization called teachthefuture.org that does great work on teaching futures to kids, primary and secondary education. And future literacy is a new component to that big tent of future studies related topics, because it adds the element of using the future for emergence. So using the future to identify assumptions and embracing complexity and uncertainty. So that is a new element, and that's relatively new. UNESCO has done an amazing job of advising a lot of governments, but to implement something systemically in curricula, in policy making, I'm sure that everybody who works in innovation or is a pioneer recognizes it just takes time. And why not in Germany? Well, it's starting. I mean, I started 5 years ago. Nobody has ever heard of future literacy in the Netherlands. And now we have a chair, we're educating a lot of people. And this is the time with COVID that we're in now, when people are starting to realize, whoa, it feels more uncertain. So, there's a lot of talk. I said, hey, maybe we should do things differently, because back to normal is crazy, right? So maybe we should rethink our decisions. And so I'm busier than ever, because it's finally landing this idea that, hey, we are in a reframe scenario. We are in this that we did not plan for, we did not prepare for, and we're here. So what do we do now? In that sense, it's becoming more, people become more and more open to think about rethinking the present and, rethinking different futures, just because we have to. And for policymakers, it is really interesting, because it's by imagining multiple futures, you're not saying you will make better decisions, but it's more likely you will make better informed decisions. Right? If you just we use scenario planning, which is extremely useful as well, but then still, if you're not aware of the underlying assumptions that might be restricting you to be truly creative, then you might end up making the same mistakes as you did in the past. So yeah.
There are so many topics we could talk about, from migration, gender equality, the pandemic of COVID pandemic, but maybe we can talk about climate change, because I think this is kind of an interesting topic. It is already happening, but yet it also feels like this is going to be some kind of, at some point in the future, there's going to be a crisis. So how can we change the way we think about climate crisis so we can make better informed decisions? What are your thoughts on this?
Well,
I know this is.
Are you asking me to solve climate change?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, it takes a lot of, it takes a lot of political will and courage, and that is, I think, that is very important. But if you're asking me how we can use this capability to work on that, we use it a lot. So me and my colleagues were involved. We just finished a large project with Climate Kick. the EIT Climate Kick, for them to implement future literacy with their stakeholders and to really start conversations around climate adaptation using futures literacy. And I think that our approach to climate change, there's so many different layers that come to it. First of all, it's often people are short-term thinkers; they're not long-term thinkers, right? So they don't, they think that it's not here yet. So the urgency is not really present. So that is something that, and by one thing that future literacy also does, it kind of pushes you to think in 2060, 2070, and that's not what people often do. And what it does, it also stimulates this kind of empathy to place yourself in the shoes of a generation that's not born yet. So I think that is important too. And there's another thing is that this sense of urgency, so that people want to do something now. They want to change something now. So they hold on to innovations like electric cars or solar panels, and they look at the existing conditions and try to innovate them in a more sustainable way. But I think that we are, again, not being aware of what we are assuming to continue, and that we need to look at the narrative itself. It's not about, we can depend on technology, because that is one of the biggest assumptions that people make around climate change, is that technology will save us. Somehow we will come up with new ways to be more sustainable. That might very well be true, but what if we're not? So is there something else in our behavior, in our mindset that needs to shift? And we can only do that if we go really deep down to the core of what we hold dear and what we find very important. So many future literacy workshops and labs I've done, when I ask people, what is your probable future? What do you think is going to happen? They say, very high tech, flying cars and electric cars and technology. But when I ask them what it is that you really want, what is a desirable future, they often say human nature, back to nature, human connections, peace. I just want to, they seem like cliches, but that stark difference, how people anticipate on a probable future and how they make decisions based on what they think, instead of what it is that they really want. And that is a first step in the realization, just to think, what is a probable future for you and what is a desirable future for you? That first step, which is the basic first step in any future literacy intervention, can already be mind shifting. To engage with the future, just accept the idea that it is not set in stone. And I think, and it really starts with our behavior, but we are so attached to our way of life that we see nature as not a part of us. And that narrative that we somehow need to fight climate change, well, we are part of nature. We are part of the climate. We are a product of it. So if we are fighting something, we're fighting against ourselves. And I think so there's a lot to do in reshaping the narrative, is that what can we learn from nature? What can we learn about our own behavior, about our own wishes and dreams and desires? What can we learn about our own resilience? How can we be in the moment and just, taking advantage of the emergence that is around us? So and that's what I mean by slowing down in times of urgency, is that asking ourselves these questions will ultimately be so much more effective and sustainable than coming up with the latest innovation to solve a short-term problem.
It feels very contradictory to slow down when you have the feeling like we have no time. So what do you think about Fridays for Future, for example, and Greta Thunberg saying the house is on fire? This is, what she's saying and what Fridays for Future is putting forward in politics is we need to be quicker, much quicker. And this is contradictory to what you're saying right now. So maybe this is not a contradiction or one we have to live with, but what do you think about like a new movement that is trying to to change something.
Extinction Rebellion, and Greta, it is urgent. The house is on fire, and it's their future at most at stake, right? I mean, young people. If I'm not old, but I've lived. How I see the future is very different from young people. They still, so of course, we have colonized their future in a way, because of course there's this urgency, and people need to wake up. Yeah, like I said, there's no political will or courage or this sense of urgency because of that short-term thinking. So it's definitely that wake-up call. But what I mean by slowing down is that the solution is not responding in a way that is an old way of responding, because then how we respond to the problem becomes part of the problem. The problem goes deeper than that, and we haven't even begun to unpack it. The problem is in our behavior. So we can act fast, but it's not going fast because our systems are the way we take decisions, and the way our system is organized benefits a certain group of companies and a certain way of life. And unless we are willing to look at that and really fundamentally change that, we need to dig deeper. And we cannot. It's not a quick fix. It took us a long time to get here. It's not a quick fix, but yes, we have to start now. But the danger in it, if you think it's a quick fix, if you feel urgent means quick action, no, it is definitely, or we have to do something now. But by doing something, sometimes a lot of changes happens by not doing, and just really having a close look at what it is that you actually want to do. And I think that is important. So it's slowing down in order to speed up and get there faster. But it really starts with that first step. So I think that people are, what I said, that how we respond to a problem becomes part of the problem, because that's what we're used to, and that's what we need to rethink.
Let me add a question from the audience. How can we identify different assumptions?
Yes. Well, I would like to, you have to come to my classes. No, but I think, this is, future literacy is a capability, and that involves identifying these assumptions. And one way, a very most important, most effective tool is through these future literacy, we call them laboratories. They're like workshops, very hands-on, when we play, when there's this learning curve in place, right? It's first imagining probable desires, probable futures, desirable futures, and then by reframing very effectively and scaffolding and guiding and facilitating that process, you get to understand that, so if I maybe think about this, we're in COVID. And the corona crisis. So think about it. This is a reframed scenario. This is something that you did not plan for, you did not prepare for. So think about it. What assumptions did you have about the future before corona happened? What were you taking for granted? What were you not seeing? And I can share a very strong assumption I had. I used to travel all the time. And for UNESCO and for the UN, for all these organizations. And it's what I love the most. It's not sustainable, I know, but I love it so much. So when COVID happened, the past year, I've not been able to traveling. And what I've come to understand is that apparently I had this strong assumption that in order to travel or in order to lead an adventurous life, I need to physically move from A to B. And I thought, what if I let go of that idea that I need to physically move and see what adventures are around me? And now I see a lot of things that I just completely overlooked before. It's a cliche that people say, I never realized there were so many birds in my neighborhood, or that my own country is so actually really quite beautiful, or how important the contact with my neighbors is, right? So we see different things that we just didn't see before. And that is what playing with futures does to your brain, right? It is playing with futures, imagining multiple futures, also futures you do not per se like or plan for, helps you to think about, if you're willing to ask that question, what do I see now that I didn't see before? What was I taking for granted? Those are the assumptions. And some of them go very deep. And that's why we have designed all these workshops and trainings. It's hard to do that. But it is possible. Sorry.
No, the way you're describing it.
I have to take a sip of tea. That's okay.
Oh, that's okay. It sounds like imagination is like a muscle we can train. I find that really interesting. Like our brain can expand somehow to be capable of more imagination. And I wonder what schools or educational institutions in general play here. Schools and universities, should there be a subject in school or any higher education institution that, about futures literacy? So every kid, every student is training that muscle?
I think, kids are, I don't have kids, but the people with kids, I'm sure it's often said that kids are, a lot more creative creatures and more imaginative than we are. So what happens when they go to school? They learn a lot, but they also unlearn a lot, right? So it's interesting to look at the relation between learning and unlearning. And so in terms of imagination, so we unlearn imagination, and then we get all these images of the future that are given to us in the media and Hollywood, etc. So then we become poor at it, and we think, oh, okay. So to excuse me, to train the muscle, I think it's very important. It's important to have courses around futures, and it's important to gain knowledge about the study of anticipation and the discipline of futures, etc. But it's also a capability that you can implement in all kinds of disciplines. Excuse me. Really. So what we are trying to do is that future literacy, it's not as much about gaining knowledge on different kinds of futures, but the skill of imagination, and therefore becoming more comfortable with complexity, is important in any kind of discipline. So we're trying to implement that in all the curricula at my university. I'm really, really, really sorry. I have to.
That gives me a chance to check the many questions we have here from the audience. Thank you so much. It's even more I can ever ask. I think Loes.
It's not COVID. I've just been talking a lot and I haven't been drinking enough. So yeah.
Let me just so while you're sipping your tea, I can ask another question. Someone's asking that, saying that the concept of futures literacy feels very academic, and we're now talking about education, about policy making. So who are the people that are addressed by this concept? Are teachers, professors, politicians? Is it also me, just as a normal citizen? And how do you make it not so academic so that everybody can be addressed by it?
A great question. Great question. It's a question that I'm working on, and I sometimes struggle with as well, because from UNESCO, which is United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization. Wow, this never happens. So yeah, it comes to, and so first of all, a lot of research needs to be done, right? So there's a theoretical framework designed by Real Miller, and there's a lot of data we're still trying to gather and to do research on the impact and the design principles and what anticipation really is. And so there's a lot of knowledge creation necessary. And at the same time, if it's capability, like learning how to read and write, how do we bring it to the streets, right? How do we actually make it accessible? And of course, it is accessible for the simple reason that everybody, also simple citizens, use the future. And the step is to stretch the imagination. And I think that's a skill that everybody has, that, one is maybe feels better than others, but diversifying futures just to embrace the fact that there's more future than just one is not, that's the low-hanging fruit. That is not something that is very complex to do, right? Stretch imagination. And then becoming aware that, okay, I didn't see that before, is a next step. So it's not, the theory behind it is complex, and it's it's being, the research is being done for it. But for us academia, it's not a next step to translate it into something that is reproducible, but also for people to understand. And it starts with just asking simple questions. If you're an educator at school, just ask a what if question, or ask yourself a what if question. What if this would happen? What if that would happen? What would I do? How would I feel? Why would I feel like that? So, or just talking to other people, sharing your ideas about the future, just asking someone else, what do you think the world looks like in 50 years? You'll see that even if you're living with that person, you'll have a different image of it. So future literacy, the start, and diversifying futures is really happening in the relationship with others, within the communities. And then you can, practice that yourself and ask yourself this question and see these opportunities. But it's really important. It's a collective intelligence knowledge creation process. And so the collective is important. And that's why a lot of these workshops, almost all of the workshops that we do and the trainings, we try to gather diverse perspectives. So it's not just teachers, but getting students there, not just professionals as entrepreneurs, but get kids in there, artists, poets. So it is important to diversify these futures, because that's when we are stretching the imagination. And there's not much to it. Just having to talk about it is already incredibly enriching. But it's a very good question, because yes, it's a complex theory. And when I started this, there was, I was lucky enough to learn it from the founder, Riel Miller at UNESCO, but there was no one who could explain it to me in layman speak. So there's lots of ground to discover. So I think I think we're just making headway by building a lot of capacity for people who can facilitate these processes. Mm-hmm. So I think, but it's a really good question. And there's a lot to learn in that regard. So, yeah.
You said that futures literacy is going to be part of the curricula at schools and universities. On a different level, I guess, how do schools and universities have to change in the present so they will be still important institutions in the future? I don't know if this is a weird question, but I wonder, you need the institutions to remain open and to remain diverse. So institutions have a muscle themselves, right?
Oh, yes. I'm not sure if I understand that's a question from the audience?
This is a question I had.
Oh, you had, okay.
Yeah, so I wonder, if we're, for example, talking about digitalization, right, how should a school deal with digitalization so that it will be able in the future to still think about the future, right? How do institutions that teach us about the future remain open? Right.
Yeah, this is a really good question, because there's almost like there's almost like a tension in there, right? So we're teaching you to be open, but then are we also not colonizing the future of the universities, right? So absolutely. And I think by introducing future literacy in the curriculum, that's as a course, but as a pioneer in education, I've come to understand that teaching, if I want students to become critical thinkers, it has no point in teaching them critical thinking on Tuesday morning from 9 to 11, right? So it's and then we're done. That's not how it works, right? This is a mindset, a capability, so it needs to be nurtured. So there's different layers that we should remain open. So if I teach future literacy and I think, this is it. If I am not open towards learning, or the almost porous and moving elements of the discipline itself, then I'm not doing a good job. So at universities, I think this is an important capability, but I don't know what future generations will care about. So I think for a university, it's extremely important to let go of this idea that they can plan or prepare everything. If you're saying that, we're preparing our students for the unknown, then what are you saying? Can you leave space in the curricula for emergence? Maybe to be very concrete, this situation in COVID has caused my university last year to move everything online, right? And so did we. So we moved a lot of practices online. And they did it from the sense that students cannot stay behind in their credits, etc. So we need to move quickly. And this is what I mean by slowing down. Move quickly and just go everything online so the classes can continue. But I think this is the typical situation that is a huge learning opportunity in itself. If we're just thinking that we can just continue to giving the same classes as we did before, but then just online, then we're missing a huge opportunity, because there's so much richness in this space for students, to experience boredom. What does it mean to be, how can that spark creativity? Maybe rethinking their study altogether, rediscovering their own identity. What are ethics? How does this impact society? Every discipline has a place in this situation. And I think that's why now often higher educational institutes are not fully equipped to deal with emergence, right? Because they made plans for 5 years. It's there. It's in the plans. It's in the system. You can't just change it. And this is what happens if you don't have enough space for that. I think it is so incredibly crucial to even in your strategic decision making, but also just in your plans. Make plans, prepare, sure, but make sure that there's room to embrace that uncertainty.
If you're making too many plans, you might fall behind, because
you might fall behind.
Yes.
The world changes. Yeah, exactly. You might fall behind, and we're just overlooking things, and ultimately we're going to pay the price for that. I really believe that. If I'm so. The students that I meet, it's hard. These times are hard, and there's little space for them to examine what that is. And if we only had the courage, almost, I want to say, to have that anxiety have a place in their learning and rethinking, teaching them how to rethink things. I mean, we could come out of this crisis, just be better for it, or maybe not better, but at least more imaginative. And maybe we rediscovered something about ourselves that we didn't know before. So I think it's an incredible missed opportunity.
Somebody in the audience is commenting that in Germany, we usually are running behind things. For example, in digitalization. Really, I find it interesting.
Okay. The trains maybe, but yeah.
No, but well, the question is, what would you say to decision makers in order to implement the idea of futures literacy in schools and universities? But maybe this question also brings up something about what part of the world are we talking about, and how are different countries and nations and their traditions capable of implementing a new concept into their policy making. And maybe Germany, I mean, it's a democracy, but it's making plans, as you just said, and it can fall behind because of that. So how do you implement something like this into policy making, and how do the countries differ depending on what kind of nation they are?
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is the question that I often get when I introduce this topic. People say, how can I implement? And I said, well, first, maybe become it. Huh? So there's always this, especially in this part of the world, in the sense, okay, so this is a new capability. How can I implement it? Well, first, maybe you should learn the capability, right? How can you, and then because future literacy is not just something that you implement onto others, but it's also something that if you want to change your own decision making, you can make the decision to implement future literacy in the school. But if you become better at imagining futures, you will change, your decision making will change with it. You will make different decisions, better informed decisions. It impacts your strategic decision making yourself. And also, and that helps, should go hand in hand, right? It's like, how can I use this? Well, you'll know once you learn the capability yourself. So that goes hand in hand. It's like practicing what you preach, right? I think I really fundamentally believe in that. I cannot teach my students how to do this if I don't know how to do it, right? So I think that's important. And yeah, some countries are more keen on planning. Others countries are more open for the unexpected. But in all cases, everybody uses the future in different ways and for different purposes. But I would say, yeah, there's a difference in planning and preparation, but also difference in narratives, right? Some once did this lab in Nigeria, also in Morocco. It was about the future of Africa. And there was this strong narrative, also by a lot of other people, that what Africa as a continent, its place in the world, and some of it goes really deep, right? And it's that. So sometimes it's not just an easy exercise to rethink a certain narrative, but it just goes generations, and it's sometimes even traumatic. Certain colonized versions of the future. So that differs per country, and everywhere you go, when you're hopefully we can contribute. And UNESCO has been doing a great job in that, contributing to looking at complex and challenging issues of our time, right? So you introduce this, and then it's just really important to co-design it with the people, the kind of the local champions on the ground. So when in a couple of weeks I will do a lab for the United Arab Emirates, now online. But then it's important to co-design, to work together, to design how will this actually become a reality. And that's why it's important to build capacity in different places. Because I am also very Dutch, so I come to these places with a Northern European perspective. Although I travel a lot, I still have that bias. So that's why it's important to always do this in co-design and collaboration. We don't learn by ourselves. We only learn in relationship to others in this case. So that becomes really important. And there's nobody, no country, no age, no person or a living organism that cannot become better at imagining or understanding why they use the future. I fundamentally believe that, even Germans.
Futures literacy is a concept that has been adopted by UNESCO. You mentioned that. And I think by that, it's becoming a very powerful concept. I guess you are also a powerful woman in that way. And I think there's some kind of ethical dimension to this, because you have used the term of decolonizing the future, which is a highly political term that we are using with regard to the past and the history of colonialism. So how do you make sure you, as a UNESCO chair, and your colleagues, that you're in an ethical and responsible position, and you're not decolonizing the
colonizer, the colonized future?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a very good question, and the term is we talk about decolonization. We refer to a traumatized past, but also think about the past. In a sense, the past and the future are pretty similar in that sense. That the stories of our past are also curated, heavily curated, right? That what we remember, what is written in the history books, somebody made a decision to put that story in there. And a lot of voices and stories and narratives are not being heard. So, and that also has a huge impact on the situation in the present. Same for the future. So if our future images are heavily curated by people who are colonizing, then and by colonizing I mean that she's literally planting a flag saying that this is what the future is going to be. If somebody tells me this is what happened in the past, okay, I believe it. There's some artifacts lying around and books and that tell you that are historic facts, sure, but they're written by somebody, and so somebody's planting the flag in. So this is what so the same for the future. So how do we make sure that the future becomes it's not just colonized by a few, but it's for all? And future literacy is the capability that, because I will never say this is what the future will look like. What we do is that we ask people, what are your images of the future? And then share. And then we say, let's imagine even more. Let's play with this idea. Let's play with that idea. Let's come together and understand what are the sources of our hopes and fears. Where do they come from? Can we look at them again? And then you'll see that future images might change, and then a week later you'll do the same thing, and then it changes again. So this is the idea: is that we want to give people and young people to reclaim the power of imagination, right? So to really look at these narratives. So I think it's the capability. UNESCO, the United Nations, have called this the capability of the 21st century, the essential capability of 20th, because it has a power or the potential to decolonize very stronghold narratives. And I'm not just talking about political, but also think about tech companies, how they colonize our future if it comes to tech, right? So, I have no idea what the future looks like. I have an idea, but I will never say this is how it's going to be ever. I know it's just an imagination. I know it's just an anticipation, and we also don't know what future generations care about, right? So, as Riel Miller taught me, he said the only way we can show that we care about future generations is living by our values in the present, and that's kind of compost thinking. How can you leave a healthy compost? Because we're all, we're all going to end up as compost. How do we ensure the quality of our compost? And we can only do that by living in the present according to our values. And whatever comes to that compost, whatever will come up as new growth or new ways of new life, that will come out of that. But that's the only thing that we can do. And by understanding what our values are, we can use multiple futures to understand what is really dear to us.
We're almost at the end of our discussion, and I initially wanted to ask you, so what will the future be like after COVID? But I have now learned I should ask you, how do you imagine
yes.
the world?
And do you want a probable or a desirable future? Yeah.
How do you imagine your world maybe after the pandemic is over?
Okay. My world, I used to travel a lot, really small. And I think that I will adopt a new way of being and of traveling. I think that that I will stay in one place a lot more longer. And I imagine that I will look for different ways of knowing, because behind this screen, this artificial way of learning, of knowing, for me, has been, I really rediscovered this desire and need to learn from the plants outside. So I think I will use that a lot more and just be, just slow travel and be in one place for a longer stretch of time. And I think that's what the future will be, for me at least. And then hopefully design. That's what I design longer learning places for young people to practice this capability, not just short training, but really a longer stretch, and find spaces for us to slow down. I think that will be beautiful.
I have a very last question from the audience, which I find very nice, because to answer this question, I think you have to travel to the past. How would you have reacted back as a young girl or a young woman, when someone had told you about futures literacy?
That's I think I'm not the only thing I can say, because I'm a future thinker. I don't really think about the past that much. But what I can imagine is that I always had this incredible curiosity and exploratory mindset. So for me, is always exploring the unknown. And if somebody who told me about multiple futures, etc., I would probably be very excited and comfortable, because one of my favorite children's books was about this future image of Greenland after the Third World War. And Europe was all dry and desert, and Greenland had turned into this incredibly fertile ground and land. And then people from Europe would sail there to looking for resources. And Greenland was this incredible, beautiful place. It was 120, 100, whatever, only run by women. And they would never kill animals, only the ones that were already dead. They would only eat like already dead animals. And they have this incredible penal system where a criminal would not thrown to prison, but would get isolated somewhere in the mountains with a mark on that would fade after a few years. So they had all this society that was painted. There was incredible, rich society, and I was just amazed. And I thought, wow, and and I just remember thinking, why not? And back in the day, I mean, a country run by women was just, that's still kind of, it's still a fantasy, but it's but only so. Yeah, I think as a girl, maybe I was already playing with that a little bit. So yeah, I think I was just approach it with a curious and exploratory mindset, as I still have today.
Loes Damhof, thank you very much for this inspiring discussion. Also, thank you, dear audience, for being part of this, for sending your questions. Please imagine, again, the applause to this event. My final remark aims, of course, to the future. Tomorrow, starting at 2 p.m., the Körber Foundation is inviting you to the Digital Summit, where you, Loes, will give a keynote lecture on futures literacy. You can find the program online. Thank you all very much. Have a good night. Take care and goodbye.